The worlds of commodities and crypto were never meant to intersect. At least that's what the traditional markets believed. Uranium, one of the most tightly regulated and strategically sensitive materials on the planet, has long remained inaccessible to everyday investors. But a new wave of tokenized infrastructure is challenging that assumption. By using blockchain to turn a complex physical commodity into a transparent, auditable, and programmable asset, an entirely new market dynamic may be emerging. In this episode of the Age of Tech podcast, we are really curious about what becomes possible when a commodity like uranium is brought on chain with real-world custody behind it. How do retail, institutional, and Web3 native investors behave when given access to a market they've never had access to before? And what does this early adoption tell us about the future of other tokenized real-world assets and the credibility layers needed to make them mainstream? To help us unpack these ideas, ATP is joined by Arthur Breitman, a co-founder of Tezos and the visionary behind XU308. Arthur, thank you so much for joining the show today. How are you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me.
It is my complete pleasure. Okay, let's just jump right into this thing. Why are we tokenizing uranium now? What fundamental inefficiencies or structural barriers in the uranium market convinced you that blockchain-based tokenization was the right solution now?
Well, I think there are two parts to it. Is that one is why make, generally speaking, investment in uranium more accessible now, and the second thing is why do this on a blockchain? And I think the latter. I'll start with the latter part, which is that if you want to tokenize today, something, you might as well. If you're building a new market, you might as well leapfrog existing technologies and use the best thing that's out there. And if you want to have a global 24/7 market where you have a lot of resiliency, a lot of security, you want it to be globally accessible, doing it on the public blockchain gives you that. You want compatibility with custodians, you want compatibility with financial primitives. I would say it's just generally the best place to issue assets today. It's probably on a blockchain. It's fantastic technology for doing that. So I don't think it's something specific to uranium, but if you are going to do it, blockchains are a great place to do it. Now, why uranium? I think uranium is an extremely interesting asset. Generally speaking, there's a lack of, I find that there's a lack of market for spot commodities, even though they are really interesting markets. And specifically, uranium is an extremely important commodity, especially at a time where there's a lot of renewed interest in nuclear power. People are rebuilding nuclear power plants. The forecast for the demands of energy are through the roof for AI data centers. So there's going to be a need of uranium to power all these nuclear power plants. That makes it a very important commodity. And despite that, the only way you could trade spot uranium prior to uranium.io is by buying 100,000 pound or 50,000 pound worth of weight. At places like Cameco, which doesn't really work unless you're trading in very, very big size. So the goal is to make it easier to trade and more easily accessible.
Have you heard, do you think that some of this nuclear power is actually going to get built in space as well? I know some people that are actually building data centers in space because there are less like heat concerns for them. I know this didn't come up, but you just made me think about this, right? Because a lot of the energy consumption we're seeing now is through these AI data centers. But if you build it in space, can you attach like the nuclear power to a satellite as well?
I'm a bit of a space skeptic. I think it's useful. There are a few things which are useful. I think something like Starlink, for example, is obviously very useful. Having global connectivity on Earth via satellites, and then once you pass satellites, there's not a whole lot. So if you want to put a data center in space, you have a few problems. Uh, One that people bring up all the time that I used to bring up, I now feel is maybe a bit overrated as an issue, is heat dissipation. So, space isn't necessarily cold. There's parts which are cold, and then if you're facing the sun, it's very warm. The problem is your chips, they need to dump their heat somewhere. And if you're on Earth, you are in a giant heat sink. You can use water, you can use the atmosphere. In space, the only thing you can do is you can radiate away. Now, if you're going to have giant solar panels, you can have giant heat dissipators as well. It's a linear cost in terms of like how much more thing you are. So I now believe you can deal with the heat problem, but it's definitely not better in terms of heat. Like It's worse from a heat perspective than being on Earth. But you can do things. But then the question is like it's still extremely expensive to launch things in orbit, and it's very heavy. You're going to launch all that for what exactly? Like, and you're sending depreciating material as well. So I guess you can replace the chips, but it's very expensive. The benefits are extremely unclear. Like you don't, it's not like a defense benefit. Like oh, people, like you can shoot a satellite with a missile. Uh, it's not a cost advantage. There's really not, and again, for a lot of people waxing about uh, uh, space, I will give you the bottom of the ocean or the Antarctica. Like both much better places. Like it's terrible. It's really hard to do things down in the ocean. It's still a whole lot easier in space. So I'm not really convinced of the value of doing this in space. In theory, if you're doing it in space, could you attach nuclear power? Yes. There's difficulties in sending radioactive elements in a rocket. You don't, if your rocket blows up and it's sending your nuclear fuel, just doesn't really make a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
you're taking way
Like
you're
you
taking
could
way too
do,
much risk. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, you have solar, like you can do solar, but like it's nuclear power plants are really heavy things. So no, I don't think anytime soon. I think they're going to be built on Earth, or those they could be built at sea. It's underrated. Like putting nuclear power plants at sea is underrated.
Yeah, I mean there've been nuclear submarines for decades, right? So we've already perfected how to make nuclear
Yeah,
power
yeah. The
available at
Navy's
sea,
been doing
right?
it for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I went to school right near Groton, Connecticut, which is where a lot of the American nuclear subs are made and put into the ocean. Can we talk a little bit because you mentioned resiliency and transparency? These are core values, at least in my mind, right? Of crypto native values.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how?
I don't think I mentioned transparency.
Okay, I did. Sorry, in my intro, I mentioned transparency.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yes. No
No,
worries.
perfect. I love when people push back on me because it makes it sound like it's real. That's one of the other things that I should have
Well,
said.
because everyone who's selling blockchain is selling transparency as like a value. And God, I should check the copy on uranium.io to make sure it's not like it's a bug. The transparency is a bug on the blockchain. It's not a
So
feature.
I don't disagree with you. I think it's a bug because I can get way too much information about what somebody else is doing on the blockchain. Why do you think it was built in as
Yeah.
this is I didn't intend to talk about this, but you brought it up, so I need to ask, right? Why do you think it
Yeah.
was built that way so that it is
Oh,
transparent?
it all starts with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is built as a transparent ledger. And the reason Bitcoin is built as a transparent ledger is like building a non-transparent ledger is much harder. It's just like it's a hard computer science cryptographic problem to do a non-transparent ledger. And Satoshi didn't know how to do it. Asked about how to do it. Wasn't sure. Was interested in solutions to do it. Uh, probably didn't like. Probably didn't really live to see the solutions live, but they exist. So they are technological solutions for that get rid of this issue. But then people latched onto this, and there was this idea of like, oh no, the transparency is a feature, and then you ended up with all these supply chain solutions, and they were like, oh, if the blockchain gives us transparency in transactions, perhaps it'll give us transparency in supply chains. A lot of this doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, having transparency in supply chains can be a great thing. You don't really need a blockchain for that. What you need is like people recording things like at every point of intake and like putting the signing the data, putting it out there. I guess you can use a blockchain if you want to. There's nothing wrong with that, but the blockchain doesn't do a whole lot for you. Like the blockchain solves the double spending problem. So if you're not trading something, if you're not exchanging property, oftentimes not a lot of sense to have a blockchain. And if you are exchanging property, it's not like, and to be clear, there is some value in financial systems in some amount of transparency. Like I'm not saying that all transparency is bad. So the main thing I can think about is if you look at the financial crisis of 2007, um, there's a interesting paper that was written after the financial crisis by Ramakant called I think it was called Too Interconnected to Fail, arguing that the main issue wasn't so much the lack of but wasn't so much the amount of leverage or the bad debt that was in the system. It was the lack of trust that came that you don't know what your counterparty owns. And so you're trying to like trace all the counterparty of like who owns what. And because you don't really know if your counterparty is solvent or not, because you don't know what they're sitting on, you don't lend to them. And you get into this credit crunch all of a sudden from the lack of transparency.
Yeah. It would have been a little helpful back in 2007 and 2008 if there had been a little bit more transparency around counterparty risk. But I mean, that's not the way the normal financial system was built either, right? So fair enough. It would have been nice to
So
know.
if you build a complex system of debt between many parties, like being able to clear that debt efficiently and being able to have transparency there, that can be quite valuable.
Do you think this is a controversial feeling inside the blockchain community, or is this something that's widely held that people are thinking, you know what, we need less transparency here because there's way too much information out there that's available for people, but that's the way it was built because that was the way that it was easy to build when it was first conceived. Do you know what I mean?
I think we're in an industry with lots of salespeople, and whenever you try to turn your downsides into upsides, say like, look, you have transparency, and yeah, there's some. First of all, it's true, right? This is not, at least it's not a false claim. There is definitely transparency. Whether or not it is a good thing, that depends on like how much you want to buy that story. There's some benefits to transparency, like I mentioned it. I say like if you have a complex system of interconnected credits, you benefit from transparency. There's some downsides, like you don't want everyone to know necessarily your position.
Yeah.
I think that today with pseudonymity on the blockchain, you get a reasonable enough amount of anonymity or pseudonymity. Like you might, if the FBI does a bunch of chain analysis, it might be still able to track you, but it's not really your concern. It's not like glaringly obvious immediately to you, competitors, what your position is. The other thing is it depends on the liquidity of the position. I think if you are a fund and you're interested in like buying a bit of uranium, the fact that you have a position and that people might attribute to you on chain is probably not a big issue. It's a big it's a big market as opposed to you're a hedge fund and you're taking secretly a short position into a semi-traded stock, in which case like, you really don't want to tip your hand. It depends on the type of trading you're doing. If you're doing some buy and hold for the next like couple of years of uranium, less of the transparency and information is a bit less of a concern to you. And you can always use intermediaries. You could be using a custodian, for example, who's going to be holding the tokens, not in your name. So you can still get. It's not like you're putting all your information out there on the chain. You still get a reasonable degree of of privacy. What you get, I would say, perhaps the word is wrong. What you don't get is not transparency. What you get is integrity, and that is like you can see how many tokens have been minted.
Right. You get visibility.
You,
Yeah.
you can compare that to to a trust account who's holding who's holding uranium in custody. So rather than transparency, I would say it's integrity. Like you have some sense essentially of like the accounting of it all, and you have a trace of the accounting of it all. That is the value.
Got it. I mean, look, I sat on a trading desk for years, and one of the things we never wanted anybody to have was transparency for the positions that we were holding, particularly for, as you mentioned before, illiquid stocks or illiquid commodity positions, because it just gave them an edge. And I can tell you about very specific trades that we did where somebody knew we had an illiquid position in something, and it's not that hard in an illiquid market to bid it up, bid it up, bid it up, or to short sell it down, 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 down. So, yeah, the integrity is important. Do we want to talk a little bit about maybe the architectural breakthrough behind uranium.io and maybe like why what you guys are doing is different than what like the traditional commodity brokers or ETF markets are doing right now?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the look. To be honest, from a technical perspective, so it sits on Tezos, fantastically technological and beautiful blockchain. If I'm a bit biased, but I will say that. But that being said, as an application on the blockchain itself, tokenization is fairly straightforward. You have a token, chain address. You can actually trade it on chain. There's an there's an order book actually that sits on chain that you can use. You can even borrow against it on the blockchain. So there's a few primitives, but the tokenization itself is fairly straightforward. More of the architecture is actually the legal architecture around it too. Like how do you go from a piece of uranium that's sitting in Canada to a token, and that took a lot of legal work. It took legal work over several years. It took working with partners like Curzon, for example, to better understand the uranium market, and Archax in the UK, who's FCA regulated, to work on the tokenization. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, you end up in a position where this is not a fund, and so when you hold a token of uranium.ie, you actually are directly the ultimate beneficiary owner of some uranium oxide. I should precise, we're saying uranium as a shorthand. It is uranium oxide, or U3O8, so 3 atoms of uranium, 8 atoms of oxygen, also known sometimes as yellow cake.
Yellow cake.
So,
Okay.
it's the same you get out of the ground before it's refined.
Got it. So it's a pre-refined commodity. It's just super interesting. Where can you mentioned like the legal aspects of this? Where does like local regulations or even regional regulations come into play, if you don't mind me asking? Right, it must have been a long slog. Actually, you said 3 years to get all this stuff done. But how does it differ if I am in Canada and I want to buy this, or if I am in Japan, or even if I'm in like Indonesia? Like, how is it different?
In general, the regulation around spot commodities is much lighter than around other assets.
Even for uranium?
There's really like tight regulation around equities. And equities would be saying like, if I were selling you an equity, I would say like, oh, I have a mine here. Come and give me money, and I'm going to get all the uranium out of it. And the Mark Twain definition of a mine is that it's a liar sitting next to a hole in the ground. And so this is highly regulated because historically there's a lot of people who lied and said like, oh yeah, sure, I'm gonna dig it up, believe me. So whereas a commodity, it's like it is what it is. You have to make sure it's there, but aside from that, it doesn't require as much regulation. Like commodity futures are regulated because again, it's like, oh, I will give you the commodity, but not now. Sometimes later.
Right, sometime
So
later.
you can understand why there's regulation here. Spot commodities is much lighter in general. So that makes it a bit easier.
But one of the things that people do, like when they do buy a future or some kind of commodity, right? If like they can actually take delivery of this commodity, is it really okay for regular people to take delivery of uranium?
It is possible to take delivery, but most regular people would not be able to take delivery. So in order to take delivery, you do need to hold certain licenses.
That's what I thought.
And it's important that some people, if no one could take delivery, then
sure, some people have to. Then it has no value, right?
Because right? You gotta have someone in the system who's able to take delivery. That being said, if you try to, if you show up and try to take the delivery and you're not running a refinery, you're gonna have a lot of pressure. So, yes, it's possible, but only for like very, like regulated party who can actually take delivery of this. I will say this though, in terms of uranium, the uranium becomes more and more tightly regulated as it gets more refined. So the uranium oxide, the stuff you get in the ground, yes, there's a regulation around it, but it's not the most dangerous stuff. It's slightly radioactive. You definitely don't want to eat it with a spoon,
or a fork.
but it's not extremely hazardous. Like it's probably more hazardous in the sense that it's a heavy metal, in the same way that lead would be hazardous than from the radioactivity. You don't like once it gets refined, and refinement is the part that's very difficult. Refinement is where you have the centrifuge, so like you're turning your uranium oxide into your uranium hexafluoride as a gas, and then and it corrodes the pipes, and then you have to run it into a centrifuge. That's the part that's extremely difficult. And thankfully, because one of the reasons we have nuclear non-proliferation on Earth is because there's this step. It's the one that like Iran was trying to do under a mountain. Like that step is extremely technologically advanced and difficult, and so very, very few people master it. And the type of people who master it tend to have their shit together, which generally helps with port stability.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, it's so. Like if anyone could do it because like it's not that hard to dig a hole in the ground comparatively, right? Comparatively, it's not that hard to dig a hole in the ground and get some uranium oxide. It is very hard to turn that into fuel that you can use in a nuclear power plant, and it's even harder to turn that into fuel that you could use for military applications.
Yeah, for sure. When you were thinking about starting uranium.io, right? When you were talking to your team, what's driving this new interest in nuclear power? And before you answer, I'll tell you why. When I was a kid, nuclear power plants seemed to be popping up on a regular basis, excuse me. But then we had like the nuclear disaster in Russia. We had one in Bhopal. We had one on 3 Mile Island. Like we just had tons of these things, and people seemed to get really scared of it. And then we had an earthquake in Japan in 2011, which practically destroyed the Fukushima power plant there. What's changed? I'm just curious, like what were you seeing? What were you thinking? What were people talking about that's changed and said, we need more nuclear power now? Because frankly, it's pretty safe, right? It feels dangerous because of maybe the symbology around it, but it's actually not that dangerous. What drives this change now that says we need more nuclear power, not less of it?
Yeah, and it's a trend I've been following for a couple of years. The trend of like nuclear power becoming more and more acceptable in opinion polls, and I think there's a few things behind it. One is that time has passed since the accidents. Yeah, Fukushima is fairly recent, but like a lot of time, like the only one which was like really like the most catastrophic one was really Chernobyl. That and very very special circumstances around Chernobyl. A lot of time has passed since then, so that helps. And I also think there was people would focus on the accident, but a lot of it I think was also fears from a nuclear exchange during the Cold War, like and the idea that you're using nuclear power, there are nuclear weapons, and the world is at the mercy of like a nuclear exchange, which I think for a long time was a real possibility, and there were a lot of close calls for heavy nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. Unfortunately, that never happened. But just because it never happened doesn't mirror the fears of it happening were necessarily misplaced. So thankfully, we seem to have moved past that, and there's been a good movement around like non-proliferation and de-escalation of the build of nuclear weapon, which I think is a really positive thing. But it's further in people's memory. The other thing has been global warming. So if you are espousing an environmental cause, it used to be that 30 years ago you're concerned about nuclear power and that's your main thing. But the data doesn't really back this up. Like if you really care about the environment, or if you're concerned about the risk of accidents, like way more people die of cancer from um, the coal particles being emitted in the air from coal power plants than
Yeah.
they do
The nuclear power
from
plant, not
nuclear.
even
So like
close.
the safety record is actually absolutely excellent. Um, and yeah, you're looking at solutions to like not burn as much fossil fuels. You're going to look at nuclear. Like, sure, you can do renewables, you can do all that, but nuclear becomes a lot more attractive. And so you saw, like even a decade ago, the opinion around the younger generation shift. And I think what really drove my attention is when the majority of young Democratic voters in the US started favoring nuclear power. Because for me, that was like, that's a like as soon as like the population starts supporting something, the government in general will tend to follow suit. So like they look at opinion polls and say like, all right, it's positive. Now we're doing nuclear. So I was like, it's a matter of time before they start doing it. Now that the public supports it. So that's first. That's the first thing. It was late and it was always there. But then the second catalyst, I thought there would be a catalyst with a war between Russia and Ukraine. When all of a sudden there was this question of like Russia cutting the gas to Europe. And surprisingly, in 2022, that was not a catalyst. I was expecting uranium to really pop there, and like there was like all this organization in Germany founded by Russia to be anti-nuclear, and I thought they would go like, oh my God, we've been taken for fools, and like let's stop dismantling all of our nuclear power plants. And no, um, even even when the dependency of Germany to Russian gas was exposed,
Right.
Germany kept dismantling its nuclear power plants. So I was very surprised by this. But then the third catalyst that really did it was the explosion of AI data centers,
That's what I was going to
and the
say.
projections for the need of power. Like today, the bottleneck, for a while in 2022, 2023, the trade was GPUs. The bottleneck was GPUs. Today, the bottleneck is power. You have people who have GPUs who want to like do trading runs, and they can't do it because they just can't get enough power. So right now, they're using gas turbines.
Yeah, yeah. But
There's
big
a
but
bunch
big
of
companies like
companies that
Facebook,
use.
big companies like Facebook have already announced that they're going to start building their own nuclear power plants in the same way that they said that they're going to build their own data centers 15 years ago. And they did actually build those data centers. They're using their own bespoke data centers with their own bespoke data servers as well. Amazon does the same thing. And in a world where
Microsoft as well,
Microsoft
in
as
Three
well.
Mile Island.
Yeah, for sure. And in a world where all of these companies have already built that, you're right. They're more, and because AI uses so much power and so much compute and also stores so much more data, they're going to have to control their own energy resources to do that. And today they're not doing that. And if they start building their own nuclear power plants, remember, all of these companies, and you know this, but just for the audience, all of these companies are widely distributed across the globe, which means I feel like we're probably going to see nuclear power plants popping up all over the globe. And like people are building data. I live in Thailand. People are building data centers in Thailand. A lot of them actually. They're building them in sorry, in Indonesia and in Malaysia as well. And I don't think there's a ton of nuclear power already there. Can I ask you this though? Is it like oil where uranium is concentrated in like strategic geographical places, Or does it exist in a way like not like rare earth metals, where like China owns most of the rare earth metals or India has a ton of them, but that uranium is kind of freely available, but like you said before, hard to process and refine?
Yeah, no, it does take time to start mines, and I think there hasn't been as much respecting for uranium as there has been for oil.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
don't think it's as pocketed as oil, but there's a few places. So, like Canada has a bunch of uranium, Kazakhstan has a bunch of uranium. So there's a few places where they found it. It's not all over, um, and it's I would say for any commodity play, it's always a race against time because in some sense, like for the price of all commodities have some elasticity to demand, and their elasticity is going to be short in the short run, low in the short run, and higher in the long run. So in the long run, if you and I expect that in 20 years we're going to need lots of uranium, and we're absolutely certain of that, then the price of uranium might not go up that much, right? You're just going to have a bunch of people start mines, and you know wherever it is, it'll get found and it'll get out of the ground, and that will be it. If tomorrow all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, we didn't build all these mines, and now we realize we need uranium, then it's going to take a lot longer, and it takes a long time to build a nuclear power plant, but it takes an even longer time to like find uranium, open a mine, extract it, do all of that. The other insight is that the uranium is a small fraction of the cost of operating a nuclear power plant. Like, your main cost is capital amortization. You spent a bunch of money building the plant, and that's your main cost. You're not going to say like, "Oh, uranium is a bit expensive today. I guess I won't operate the plant that I spent billions building." No, you're operating your plant no matter what.
Do you think this is like a good macro hedge? Do you know what I mean? Like, are people actually looking around at what's going on in the world and saying, the world feels a little bit more unstable to me, and this is a thing that I think because of the way the power consumption is going, that people are thinking, I need to macro hedge this, and that uranium will end up being a macro hedge?
I think it's been quite so. Just from a statistical perspective, it's been fairly uncorrelated. I could imagine it's like getting some correlation to the AI wave. Like has been some correlation for energy in general. So like if tomorrow AI fizzles and people say, you know what, we're not going to build any data center, then perhaps that would carry over into nuclear power plants, and that would carry over into interest for uranium possibly. But generally speaking, like I said, the human power consumption has been going up for a long time. It's going to keep going up, and the main catalyst has been attitudes changing toward nuclear power plants. So, more generally speaking, also, I think that uh, if you if AI works out, and there are scenarios where it gets so disruptive that no investment matters and nothing matters because we all go through the singularity and it's all moot. But in a scenario where it's a bit more gradual than that, as the cost of intelligence goes down, what becomes more valuable is stuff. And I think it's not a coincidence that we have AI now, and and we have for the first time in decades like higher interest rates. It's like we finally have something really new out there, as opposed to like different ways of using the internet, um, and like that creates that creates this like drive for like building more power. And if the ideas become cheaper, right, what becomes more valuable relatively, and that is stuff, right? So all of a sudden you invent a whole lot of things because you have all these discoveries. What are you going to need? You're going to need to build more factories, you're going to need more land, you're going to need more energy, you're going to need more stuff. So commodities become quite interesting in this world.
Just wanted to say this: there's a structural change taking place in the on Earth right now, and one of those structural changes, to be fair, is that a lot of populations that had been kind of left out of the global financial system for whatever the reasons are now starting to get wealthier and wealthier on a day-to-day basis. This is one of the reasons why stock markets globally are going higher. It's because more people have more money to put into things. And you're right, as intelligence gets cheaper and cheaper, the things that get more expensive are the things that you can't just like make on your own. Uranium's one of them, but any kind of commodity is one of these as well. And I'm curious, so for me, long term, I just think everything's just going to go up into the right. And I think it's going to go up into the right faster. It just depends like what that pace is. But I'm curious what you think the implication of this, not as like not a pilot, I don't want to use that word, but just as an example of what can happen when you democratize the access using the blockchain to to an asset that most people did not have access to before, is it an example of what can be done for other, even real world asset commodities, but even other RWAs that people haven't yet put on a blockchain? Does that make sense? Like, is this the example that people are going to look at and say it's working even in uranium? It should work everywhere.
I mean, hopefully they don't look at it and then we do it all, and then they only realize when it's too late, and the entire world is all using that, and it doesn't get copied until for a while. But
I
yeah,
won't tell
I
anybody
think
if you don't tell anybody.
it's a good way to do it. And also, we did something that I find a lot of people with RWAs, the approach that they've taken has been to, and there've been two waves of RWAs like before this, and one was I am an issuer, and there's a bunch of wealthy people who have gotten wealthy from crypto, and I want to target them. So I'm going to tokenize because it helps me a bit as an issuer. It's nice. Again, it's good technology for like tokenization and generally speaking, like having a ledger for your securities. Uh, I'll do that, and then they'll invest in my project because surely they want to diversify out of crypto into my project. That didn't really pan out because most people in crypto didn't really have an interest in those type of assets. It's just like not a good impedance match. Then there's a second category, which is all these people in crypto. Some of them don't own brokerages; they just want to stay on chain, and so let's give them what they want. And that has been a lot of like popular tech stocks have been tokenized, or some money market fund if they want to be flat. So there's been some success here in those assets. What I'm interested in doing is like bringing assets that are previously inaccessible, as opposed to like you want to buy a Tesla stock. There's a million ways you
I
can
was
do
gonna
it.
say this. Like, to me, this idea of like turning Apple stock into a tokenized thing just always seemed really silly because it was never that hard to buy it in the first place. So I think that's kind of what you're saying, right? It just seems a bit silly.
Yeah, but there's people who have like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of like crypto, and they want to buy this, and they never bother to open a brokerage account.
Yeah, fair enough. But I think that part's going to go away too, right? Like if I look at my daughter's generation, yeah, there's a big interest in crypto, but there's also more of an interest in like not being so far outside of like what's going on like in the real world already. Can I ask you this though? Is it necessary to build this like link on chain to off chain for these types of assets like uranium?
I mean, ultimately, it isn't, like uranium exists in the physical world, right? So there are some assets on blockchains which are purely endogenous. So, a cryptocurrency, the ultimate arbiter of like what a cryptocurrency is a blockchain itself. Uh, I would say like any intersubjective assets you can build on a blockchain. So money is intersubjective. Like it has value because everyone agrees it has value. A domain name has intersubjective value. The ownership of a piece of art as well. That's on, like if it's digital art, for example, that all of that is intersubjective. Um, or on the other hand, something like uranium, no, you do need to have a bridge. And a valid question is like, well, if you have to have this bridge, do you get any benefit from the blockchain? Because the whole point of the blockchain is trustlessness and all that. And I think you get fewer. Like clearly, there's something stronger about like an asset that's on a blockchain where no one can tell you it's not yours and you have really this sovereign ownership. But just because you get fewer doesn't mean you get none. Like you still get a lot of benefit. You have the fact that you're compatible with a whole range of smart contracts. It's easy to deploy. It's easy to move around. It's easy to launch products. Like you get a lot of benefits from the blockchain. You don't get 100% of them, but maybe you get like 60% of them, and that's already pretty good.
How important is self-sovereign identity to you?
I'm not sure. I think it's not really been well defined. I like identity solution. I think they're good. I think they tend to be overhyped a little bit in the sense of like it's going to change everything. At the end of the day, so we're still very much dependent on like governments to issue identities. I'd rather live in a world where identity matters a bit less than more, generally speaking. Uh, but I I haven't seen like very concrete I haven't seen very concrete ideas in this space that have really moved the needle forward.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think about it a lot just because there's so much conversation around it. You see India doing digital identity. In Thailand, everybody has a digital identity. In Singapore, they just did it. They're using it for a whole bunch of different services and stuff like that. And you're right. Like, part of me, I think you said this, if I heard you correctly, like, I'd rather have a world in which identity was a little bit less important than more important, to be fair. But I don't think we're going in that direction.
Let me put it another way. The only time in which like I have to use my identity is for regulatory reasons. So in some sense, like I never need a self-sovereign identity. But I always need a government-issued identity. It's like the government wants to change. Well, the government wants to be the government. Oh, sorry, the government wants that person to ask me a copy of my passport. And so, if I present my self-sovereign identity as that person, the government will not be satisfied with that. Um, and rarely do I need much more than that. But I think a lot of people define different things by it. Um, I like the idea of pseudonymous reputation. I think that's important. So people go on Twitter or X now or a bunch of other social networks, and then they kind of build their own brand. They kind of build their networks. And then the network can yank it from you. Like that used to be touted as like a big use case for blockchains to have systems that were truly decentralized, where there's not a party that can actually
Take stuff away
where
from
you can
you.
own your distribution.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And I still think there's value in this. Like that's a real thing. But it's very very tough to build a social net to bootstrap a social network and to get any traction on it. And it's even tougher if you're trying to be decentralized. So the centralized, even though I think that if you're a creator, if you could go onto a decentralized network and completely control your own brand and completely control your own distribution, you would prefer that. Um, People are going to go where the audience is, and so far they'll go on Twitter, they'll go on Substack, they'll go on
They go on YouTube, right? I
YouTube.
mean, yeah. Yeah, no one's going to build a decentralized version of YouTube that's going to unseat YouTube. Not in my lifetime, I think. And I think you're the same thing for Twitter and the same thing for Substack.
I think you can do it in some niches.
Yeah, for
But
sure,
also,
for sure.
the problem is like you don't really want to cater to the niche of the people who have been banned from YouTube.
Right. Like I don't want to be right. I don't want to go to that party if I'm invited to that party, right? I definitely don't want to go to that room if I'm invited into
It's
that
the
room.
old. I don't know if you know the blogger Scott Aronson. No, not Scott Aronson. Sorry, Scott Alexander. And he writes about the witch hunts are bad. You don't want witch hunts, and but if you decide to build a village where there will be no witch hunts, you do end up with a lot of witches.
Right, exactly. Witch hunts are bad, but exactly, because it's so much easier for them to exist there, and that's what I mean when I say like I don't want to go into that room because I know what's in that room, and because it's that room, it's not going to be a great room for me to be in. One last thing, and then I'll let you go. What is kind of the vision now that like Uranium.io is being launched, it's out there and stuff like that? What's the vision for it, and has there been any kind of like, before you get to the longer term thing, in the shorter term or even the medium term, has there been some kind of surprising activity or stuff that you didn't anticipate people were going to do now that this is accessible?
No, not yet. I think it's still growing, and the awareness is still spreading. Like there's a lot of people yet who don't know that it exists, or even when finding out about it, in the crypto space, they think it's a meme coin. They think like, oh, you called your coin uranium. And what's the total supply? You're like, no, 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 no. This is actual uranium. People are so shocked to find that it's something like to find something real in this space.
Yeah, fair enough. So what is it going to look like in 5 years from now? What do you think?
Well, hopefully in 5 years from now, it's not just uranium. It's most commodities, most metals, and it's where most of the liquidity exists for spot markets.
That's a big
ambitious goal.
It's a very ambitious goal, but I would love to see like other commodities that people don't have access to, right? Because there are plenty of commodities like eggs and stuff. People have plenty of access to them, right? But stuff that people don't have access to, tokenize and see if it actually makes a real difference to them. I want to thank you for doing this. I really appreciate your time today, Arthur Breitman. Thank you so much for coming and doing it. I hope you had as much fun as I did.
I did, yes. Thank you.